A shocking story tonight as King Arthur told the scribes today that there may be another Roman invasion brewing on the horizon.
The Knights Union went on strike today saying that they weren't receiving the notoriety from King Arthur that they deserve.
Eternal fiction or reality? For centuries, scientists and historians were captivated of the legend of King Arthur. No one was sure of his existence until a groundbreaking discovery has reignited the debate. Experts and scientists claim to have finally found the remains of King Arthur in a mysterious cave. If DNA tests prove the astonishing find to have successful results, Britain's most enduring legend is actually rooted in truth after all. Let's start digging in deeper. King Arthur was always real. It started like so many archaeological digs do, quietly and with little fanfare. A team from the University of Exeter had been surveying ancient cave systems near the edge of the Brecon Beacons in South Wales. Their goal was fairly modest: study patterns of early medieval settlements and burial customs in the region. The area is rich in history, but no one expected anything beyond scattered bone fragments, pottery shards, and maybe the odd Roman coin. But what they found, hidden behind a collapsed wall deep in one of the caves, could end up rewriting one of the greatest legends in British history. Behind the rockfall was a naturally formed chamber sealed off for what archaeologists estimate to be over 400 years. Inside, they discovered an eerily well-preserved group burial. 12 human skeletons arranged in a semicircle, their bodies resting beside iron swords, spears, and shield fragments. The space showed signs of careful planning: raised stone beds for the deceased, a central fire pit long cold, and remnants of what looked like ornate scabbards and fine cloaks. But the real shock came when a researcher spotted the carving on a sword hilt, a crude but clear inscription in Latin that roughly translates to Arturus Rex Quandam, the once king. The scientific team moved quickly, sealing off the cave and bringing in experts in forensic anthropology, medieval literature, and ancient metallurgy. Carbon dating on several bones and wooden scabbard fragments placed the site between 480 and 520 AD, smack in the middle of the time period that some historians associate with a historical figure behind the Arthur myth. That's rare enough. But the accompanying artifacts told a richer story: ceremonial items made of bronze and silver, weapons with Celtic and Romano-British designs, and armor consistent with a high-ranking war leader. One of the most debated items is a round shield found near the central skeleton, larger than the others, and bearing a red dragon emblem. That detail has stirred up fierce academic debate. The red dragon is a symbol long associated with Welsh resistance, and later with the Arthurian mythos. Some say it's coincidence. Others believe it's the strongest evidence yet that the man buried in the center of the cave was no ordinary warrior, but someone of legendary status. Perhaps even the Arthur. Of course, scientists and historians are approaching the claim with healthy skepticism. Dr. Rachel Wynne, a medieval historian on the team, was quick to remind the press, this may be a powerful local warlord whose story inspired later legends. It doesn't mean we've literally found Camelot. But even she admitted the combination of archaeological evidence and mythological alignment is striking, unlike anything previously discovered. DNA testing is underway to determine the origins of the skeletons, with early signs suggesting they were native to Britain, but possibly of mixed Celtic and Roman descent. Isotope analysis is being used to trace where they may have grown up and what kind of diet they had. Meanwhile, the carvings on the weapons are being carefully studied to verify their age and authenticity. Everything points to a burial of great importance, hidden away in a remote cave, perhaps to protect it from Saxon invaders or to preserve a fallen leader's legacy away from enemy hands. And then there's the mystery of why the burial was so secretive. Some experts believe the cave was intentionally sealed to hide the location from enemies, or even to fulfill a prophecy. According to some versions of the Arthurian legend, Arthur was not dead, but sleeping, waiting to return when Britain needed him most. Could the sealed chamber reflect a cultural belief that their leader was not truly gone? Did you know about that belief too? Naturally, the discovery has sparked massive public interest and controversy. Some historians insist the evidence is purely circumstantial. Others argue that if this isn't Arthur, it's someone of nearly equal importance, a figure who led in the chaotic years after the Roman withdrawal, around whom legend easily could have grown. Either way, the find is already changing how scholars view the 5th and 6th centuries in Britain, a period often referred to as the Dark Ages due to the lack of written records. For now, the cave is under tight protection while further analysis continues. The team plans to publish their findings in stages over the coming year, but they've already released 3D scans of some artifacts to the public. Museums are preparing exhibitions, and Welsh cultural groups are calling the discovery a point of national pride. For the first time, science and story seem to be meeting in the dark, damp quiet of a forgotten cave, and what they're uncovering may be the closest we've ever come to the man behind the myth. So, was King Arthur real? Did he lead a group of elite warriors who stood their ground against invaders and later became legend? The answers are still coming. For now, it's time to be reminded of this great folk hero. The legend, the man, and the mystery. King Arthur is one of those legendary figures that just never seems to go out of style. You hear about him in books, movies, TV shows, and even video games. The image of a noble king pulling a sword from a stone, ruling over Camelot, and leading the Knights of the Round Table on epic quests is burned into popular culture. But when you start digging into the story behind the legend, things get pretty wild, and pretty confusing too. Some people think he was a real person, a war leader who fought against invading Saxons in the 5th or 6th century. Others believe he's mostly myth, a collection of different stories and characters all rolled into one. Either way, King Arthur has become one of the most iconic and fascinating figures in all of folklore. One of the coolest things about the Arthurian legend is how much it has changed over time. The earliest stories don't even mention some of the stuff we associate with Arthur today. For example, the whole sword in the stone bit, that didn't show up until later. Early Welsh texts describe Arthur more as a heroic warrior than a king in shining armor. Then, in the 12th century, a writer named Geoffrey of Monmouth came along and turned Arthur into this great king of Britain in his book, The History of the Kings of Britain. That's when the legend really started to grow. Later writers like Chrétien de Troyes added in the love story of Lancelot and Guinevere, the Holy Grail quest, and the magical figure of Merlin. These stories became the foundation for what we think of as the Arthurian legend today. But here's the thing, there's not a lot of solid evidence that King Arthur ever actually existed. There are no official records of a King Arthur ruling Britain during the time he was supposedly alive. Most historians think he might have been based on a real person, maybe a Romano-British leader who fought against Saxon invaders after the Romans left Britain. Over time, stories about him probably got mixed with myths, folklore, and even religious symbolism. That's not unusual when it comes to legendary figures. Think about how Robin Hood is part history, part legend. King Arthur is kind of the same deal. He exists in this gray area between fact and fantasy. Even if he wasn't real, the stories of King Arthur still say a lot about the people who told them. The legends are full of ideals like bravery, loyalty, justice, and sacrifice, values that were super important in medieval society. The Knights of the Round Table weren't just cool because they went on quests. They represented a kind of brotherhood where everyone had an equal voice, at least in theory. And then there's the tragic love triangle between Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot, which adds this whole layer of emotional drama that makes the stories feel more human and real. The idea that even a great king could have his heart broken or be betrayed by those closest to him is something that still resonates with audiences today. It doesn't really matter whether King Arthur was a real guy or just a legend. What matters is the impact his story has had on culture and storytelling. He's inspired countless adaptations, from serious dramas to cartoons. and every generation seems to find something new in his tale. Whether it's the magic of Merlin, the romance of Camelot, or the eternal quest for something greater than ourselves, the Arthurian legend taps into something deep and timeless. So, while historians might still argue over the facts, most of us are just happy to keep the legend alive. And maybe, deep down, we all kind of wish we could visit Camelot just once. Let's see what technicalities and history say about the almost true king. For the record, King Arthur has traditionally been regarded as a historical figure, originally imagined as a British war leader and, by the 12th century, as a king. However, even in medieval times, there were doubts about the more dramatic parts of his legend, such as his supposed long life and prophesied return. Since the 18th century, scholars have debated whether Arthur was ever a real person. Today, most historians agree that the details of his story are largely drawn from Welsh mythology, English folklore, and later literary invention, rather than from reliable historical sources. Some scholars have tried to place Arthur in real history, often referring to two medieval texts, the Historia Brittonum, 9th century, and the Annales Cambriae, 10th century. These sources describe him as a Romano-British leader who fought against the Anglo-Saxons in the late 5th or early 6th century. The Historia Brittonum, often attributed to a Welsh cleric named Nennius, lists 12 battles Arthur supposedly fought, ending with the Battle of Baden, where he is said to have killed 960 men on his own. However, modern scholars question the reliability of this account. Archaeological findings show that Anglo-Saxon expansion into Britain briefly slowed around 550 CE, which supports the idea of a British victory at Baden. Historian John Davies noted this as consistent with Arthur's supposed win. Additionally, monks at Glastonbury Abbey claim to have found Arthur's grave around 1180, though this is widely viewed with skepticism. The Annales Cambriae also mentions Arthur, associating him with the Battle of Baden, dated around 516 to 518, and the Battle of Camlan, where both he and Mordred were said to have died, around 537 to 539. While these references seem to support earlier accounts, recent research indicates the Annales were compiled in the 10th century from earlier materials, and it's unclear when the Arthurian entries were added. In fact, the Baden reference may have been taken directly from the Historia Brittonum. Because of the weak and late evidence, many modern historians exclude Arthur from serious discussions of sub-Roman Britain. Historian Thomas Charles Edwards has stated that while there may have been a historical Arthur, we currently know too little about him to say anything meaningful. This modern caution contrasts with older historians like John Morris, who based much of his 1973 book, The Age of Arthur, on Arthur's supposed reign, although even he admitted the evidence was thin. In response to such efforts, another group of scholars argues that Arthur was never a historical figure at all. Archaeologist Noel Myers criticized the focus on Arthur as a waste of scholarly effort. Contemporary sources from the time, such as the 6th century writer Gildas, do not mention Arthur, although Gildas does mention the Battle of Baden. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Bede's Ecclesiastical History, and other key early texts also fail to name Arthur, often attributing British leadership at Baden to Ambrosius Aurelianus. Some researchers suggest that Arthur began as a mythological figure or folk hero, later assigned historical deeds. Parallels are drawn to figures like Hengist and Horsa, who may have started as gods or symbols before becoming historical characters. Notably, Arthur is not called king in early texts, but referred to as dux bellorum, war leader, or simply soldier. One modern theory, proposed by Andrew Breeze, suggests Arthur was a real leader who fought in northern Britain and died during the extreme weather events of 535–536 CE. However, this theory is controversial and has been challenged for relying too much on place name similarities. Scholar Nicholas Hyam also warns against separating Arthur's battles in the Historia Brittonum from the Anglo-Saxon context, as the original text doesn't support that distinction. Over the years, various historical figures have been proposed as the real Arthur, such as Roman officer Lucius Artorius Castus, British ruler Riotimus, and kings like Ambrosius Aurelianus and Owain de Dantgwyn. Still, no clear evidence has confirmed any of these identifications. Like mentioned earlier, some still believe he's going to make a heroic comeback. The return of the king. One of the most fascinating parts of the Arthurian legend is the idea that King Arthur never really died. Instead, he's just waiting. Somewhere out there, this ancient king is resting, biding his time until the day Britain truly needs him again. It's the stuff of myths, sure, but it's also the kind of hopeful, heroic narrative that people across centuries haven't been able to let go of. Let's talk about where this legend of Arthur's return comes from, how it's evolved, and why it still holds so much power today. So, first things first. Where does this whole Arthur will return thing even come from? Well, a lot of it goes back to medieval texts and chroniclers. Geoffrey of Monmouth, a 12th century cleric and one of the key figures in turning Arthur into a national legend, is often credited with the famous phrase, Rex quandam, rexque futurus, the once and future king. That idea stuck. In Geoffrey's Historia Regum Britanniae, Arthur doesn't actually die after his final battle at Camlan. Instead, he's taken to the mystical Isle of Avalon to be healed of his wounds. It's left deliberately ambiguous, and that ambiguity gave birth to a myth. Arthur's not dead. He's just sleeping, waiting. Later versions of the story leaned into this idea. In some, he's hidden away in Avalon, a sort of British fairyland. In others, he's more like a sleeping hero buried beneath a mountain or hill, ready to rise when Britain faces its darkest hour. You see variations of this across folklore, not just in Britain, but in other cultures too. More on that in a bit. To understand why people latched onto the idea of Arthur's return, you've got to look at the historical context. Medieval Britain was full of uncertainty, plagues, wars, invasions. The idea of a perfect king returning to set things right was pretty appealing, especially when the current rulers were, well, less than inspiring. Arthur, in legend at least, represented the ideal. He was brave, just, wise, and noble. His kingdom, Camelot, was seen as a kind of golden age, a utopia where fairness and chivalry ruled the day. So when things went sideways in the real world, people started whispering, maybe Arthur will come back. Maybe he'll fix this. It became more than a story. It was hope. Some Welsh legends even said Arthur would return specifically to defeat the Saxons, who, in early British history, were seen as invaders. As time went on and England faced different threats, the prophecy adapted. Arthur's return became a kind of flexible national dream, ready to be used whenever needed. It's worth noting that Arthur isn't the only legendary figure said to be sleeping under a hill. This idea of a hero who isn't dead but waiting shows up in a bunch of other cultures. It's called the king in the mountain motif. Take Frederick Barbarossa in Germany, for example. He's supposedly sleeping under the Kyffhauser mountain, ready to wake up when Germany needs him. There's also the story of Charlemagne sleeping in a hidden cave. Even in Portuguese legend, there's a similar tale about King Sebastian. These legends all serve a similar purpose. They're not really about the literal return of a dead monarch. They're about the longing for justice, for restoration, for a better time. They're a kind of symbolic safety net. Don't worry, they say. Someone good is still out there, and they'll be back when we need them most. Arthur just happens to be one of the most famous versions of this story. Now, let's talk about Avalon for a second because it's important to the return myth. Avalon is this mysterious island where Arthur is taken after his final battle. It's often described as a kind of paradise, lush, peaceful, maybe even a little magical. Some think Avalon was inspired by Celtic otherworlds, like Annwn, which were places where time didn't work the same way. In those places, people could live forever, untouched by the mortal world. That would explain how Arthur could be centuries old and still come back looking fresh. Others have tried to link Avalon to real-world locations. Glastonbury in England, for example, has long claimed to be Avalon, even claiming to have found Arthur's grave, though that was probably more about attracting pilgrims and tourists. Still, the idea stuck. If there was a real Avalon, maybe Arthur's return wasn't just a dream. And if Arthur exists in modern times, how would portray him? Always a classic name. You'd think that in the 21st century, the idea of a dead king returning would seem kind of silly. But Arthur's legend hasn't gone away, it's just evolved. Writers, poets, and filmmakers have all taken a stab at the Arthur myth. T.H. White's The Once and Future King plays directly with the idea of Arthur returning, exploring his character in deeply human, emotional ways. The musical Camelot, especially popular in the 60s, leaned into the dream of Arthur as a symbol of peace and idealism. Even the Kennedy administration in the U.S. was sometimes called Camelot because of this association with a better, nobler age. And let's not forget pop culture. Arthurian legends have made their way into everything from fantasy novels to video games. Even when the idea of Arthur himself isn't central, the concept of a hero returning to save the day, wounded but not beaten, long awaited but ultimately triumphant, is everywhere. At its heart, the legend of Arthur's return isn't really about whether or not he's coming back. It's about the human need to believe in a better future. It's about justice and redemption, and the idea that even when things seem lost, there's still hope. Arthur's not just a character, he's a symbol. When we say the once and future king, we're really talking about the belief that something good, something pure, can come back and make things right. That's powerful stuff. And maybe that's why, after all these centuries, we're still telling his story. Maybe one day when things are really bad, someone will look out across a misty field and swear they saw a figure in armor, sword in hand, ready to return. In fact, a lot of those stories borrow elements from Arthurian legend. The idea of a hidden king rising up to lead a broken kingdom? That's straight out of Arthur's playbook. Even the whole sword in the stone thing has become an iconic symbol of destiny and leadership. Movies have had a field day with the Arthur myth. There are serious takes like Excalibur, 1981, which leans into the epic and mystical vibes, and more recent reimagining like King Arthur, Legend of the Sword in 2017, which turned the story into a gritty action flick with lots of slow-motion sword fights. Then there are the parodies, like Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which made fun of the whole thing while somehow becoming just as iconic. Even Disney got in on it with The Sword in the Stone, 1963, which introduced a generation of kids to young Arthur, or Wart, and his magical lessons with Merlin. These adaptations range from goofy to dark and everything in between, proving just how flexible the Arthurian legend really is. TV shows have also embraced the world of Camelot, often with a twist. The BBC's Merlin turned the classic tale into a buddy drama, with Merlin as a young wizard trying to protect Arthur while hiding his powers. It made the story more relatable and gave it a coming-of-age vibe that younger audiences could connect with. Other series like Cursed, 2020, flipped the script even more by focusing on the Lady of the Lake as the main character, showing that Arthur's world can be told from different perspectives. Writers and creators are digging into the side characters, the women, the villains, and even the magical creatures, giving the whole universe more depth and diversity. In literature, King Arthur has been reimagined again and again. T.H. White's The Once and Future King is probably one of the most famous retellings, painting Arthur as a tragic hero who tries to do the right thing but can't escape fate. Then you have The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley, which tells the story from the point of view of the women in Arthur's life, like Morgan Le Fay and Guinevere, and explores the tension between old pagan beliefs and rising Christianity. Modern authors like Bernard Cornwell and Kazuo Ishiguro have also put their spin on the tale, showing that Arthur's story isn't just for the past. It's a lens through which we can explore modern themes like identity, loyalty, leadership, and morality. And let's not forget video games, where Arthurian legend has made a serious impact. Games like King Arthur, Knight's Tale, or Pendragon turn the myth into strategic, immersive adventures. Meanwhile, in games like Fate Grand Order, the characters are completely reimagined, like turning King Arthur into a powerful female warrior. It might sound weird, but it works, because the legend is so adaptable. Players love stepping into these legendary roles, wielding Excalibur, or making choices that shape the fate of Camelot. The interactivity of games adds a new layer to the story. You're not just watching it or reading it, you're living it. The reason King Arthur continues to thrive in pop culture is because the legend is timeless and adaptable. Every generation finds something new to connect with. Maybe it's the idea of a hero rising up in tough times, or the struggle to live up to impossible ideals. Maybe it's the drama of forbidden love, or the thrill of chasing a magical quest. Or maybe it's just the cool factor of knights in armor and enchanted swords. Whatever it is, Arthur's story keeps getting retold, reimagined, and reinvented, because it still speaks to us, even after all these centuries. Long live the king. King Arthur may be a figure from ancient legend, but his story still echoes strongly through modern culture. Since the mid-20th century, Arthurian romance has been reimagined in countless ways across novels, stage, screen, and even youth organizations. These modern versions don't just repeat the medieval tales, they often reshape them to reflect contemporary values like feminism, democracy, or national identity. One of the best-known literary reworkings is T.H. White's The Once and Future King, which portrays Arthur as a thoughtful, tragic figure and inspired both Disney's The Sword in the Stone and the Broadway musical Camelot. The musical, which focuses on the love triangle between Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot, was later adapted into a film in 1967. Around the same time, authors like Mary Stuart and Marion Zimmer Bradley added new depth to Arthurian storytelling. Stuart's The Crystal Cave and its sequels put the spotlight on Merlin, telling the story from his perspective. Bradley's The Mists of Avalon took a feminist approach, shifting focus to the women of Arthur's world, especially Morgaine, Morgan Le Fay, and Guinevere, challenging the traditional male-centered narratives of medieval romance. Arthur's world has also been kept alive through comics and pop culture icons. The comic strip Prince Valiant, running since 1937, helped introduce Arthurian settings to generations of readers. Films like John Boorman's Excalibur, Robert Bresson's Lancelot du Lac, and even the hilarious Monty Python and the Holy Grail each offered different spins, some serious, some satirical, on the romance tradition. Interestingly, not all modern portrayals stick with the magical or mythical. There's also been a big push to treat Arthur as a real historical figure, possibly a warrior leader from around the 5th or 6th century. This trend gained traction during and after World War II, when Arthur's legendary resistance to invaders resonated with British audiences. Radio plays like Clemence Dane's The Saviours and Robert Sheriff's The Long Sunset imagined Arthur as a symbol of British resilience against overwhelming odds. These versions return to the more grounded, chronicle tradition from early medieval texts like Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae. Arthur's influence goes beyond books and movies. In the 30s, the Order of the Fellowship of the Knights of the Round Table was founded in Britain to promote Christian values and chivalry inspired by Arthurian ideals. In the United States, thousands of young people joined clubs like the Knights of King Arthur, where Arthur's values were used to teach leadership and moral character. These modern adaptations show how Arthur became more than a legend. He became a symbol of honor, courage, and the idea of a just society. Even today, Arthur's name shows up everywhere, from street names to sports teams, from brand logos to pop culture references. While the average person might only know a few basic elements, like Excalibur, Camelot, or Merlin, those fragments are instantly recognizable. As scholar Norris J. Lacey once put it, Arthur is profoundly embedded in modern culture at every level. King Arthur lives on not just because of what he was, but because of what each generation sees in him. Whether he's a tragic king, a democratic hero, or a magical warrior, Arthur is constantly reborn to meet the needs and dreams of the present. Are you rooting for the scientist's discovery too? Let's hear from you in the section below. Subscribe for more.